So, one of the things that's going to be happening over the next few weeks is that this time period, which we've sort of entered, which we're talking about in relationship to postmodernism this week, and then next week we're moving into sort of Hopkins' closeout of the 1990s to 2000, right? Is we're talking about a period of time in which Hopkins' story is sort of coming to a close, and we're going to be looking at a different trajectory, or we're going to begin to be looking at a different trajectory. And so, one of the things that I want you guys to keep in mind while we're finishing out Hopkins, right? We've got chapter 8 for next week, and then we are done with Hopkins. One of the things I want you guys to be thinking about is why, even though Hopkins has this nice little summary that he does of the 1990s to the 2000s, why we are sort of going back and revisiting this before the end of the semester. And part of the reason is that the what comes next in art begins during this time period, right? So we have some ideas that I want to unpack that we're going to be looking at going forward, relating to this thing that we just spoke of in the first video, this idea of sort of the soul, quote unquote, leaving art, right? So Van Gogh's shoes have an idea about truth and beauty contained within them, according to Fredric Jameson, and Andy Warhol's shoes do not, right? There's a different intent and purpose between these two things. One of them is about production and about similarity and creating simulacra through the process of reproduction. And the other one is about one man, one idea, one specific pair of shoes, one truth being put to work, right? So this is what Jameson is positing. And one of the things that we need to sort of figure out is there is during this time a pushback to what becomes sort of, art becomes sort of degraded and like a commodity. And we talked about this on Tuesday in relationship particularly to Jeff Koons, right? He's sort of putting out in mass production things that are somewhat crass and that say certain things about the way society operates, and art is about the market. So there's an idea about branding, about certain artists having name power, that things cease to be about the making of beautiful objects, which is where David Hickey comes in, right? This idea of beauty. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about once we get past that period. Okay, so in preparation for figuring out what sort of happens in art, because you've got artwork that doesn't really have staying power, right? So the things that people are looking at, their ideas are important. So we've gone too far in the other direction. The ideas are important, but at the same time, people are not doing anything. People are not doing things that are making beautiful, significant objects. And one of the things that Hopkins is going to be invested in and interested in is the fact that beauty is what's left over when the idea falls out of context. So even though we can't be in the Baroque era and understand the complete context of a Caravaggio painting, when we look at it, we still see its beauty. And therefore, it still has lasting power. It has significance. So he says, once context is gone, beauty is what remains. And if there's no beauty once context is gone, then it isn't art, right? So he approaches formalism in a different way. It's not that he wants an absence of the artist mark. It's not that he wants pure formalism. He's like, great, ideas, great. Formal beauty, great. But if you don't have the formal beauty, it's not art. It's an idea. So this is what Hickey is thinking about, right? So we're going to talk about what happens next instead is blockbuster exhibitions come into being. And these are ways for big ideas for museums when the art is not as exciting or lush and it's more about ideas. So blockbuster exhibitions that curate ideas begin to rise during this time, right? So instead of just having sort of straightforward formal presentations of artists' work who are current or contemporary, you begin to have curators who produce ideas in the same way that artists are sort of producing ideas. So we're going to talk about some of those, some of which are included in your chapters. So let's start with the 1984 Primitivism exhibit at the MoMA. So this sort of sums up the problem with the art world in general in 1984, and to a greater extent explains why multiculturalism was necessary and begins to rise up during this time. So you have artwork of Greenberg's modernism juxtaposed next to African, in the broadest sense possible, anthropological objects. So there's no specificity in regards to cultural use or interest in the African objects themselves in terms of their historical context. There's only interest in them and how they inform or serve as a source for modernist art objects. So it drew visual comparisons that basically show how European and American artists of the avant-garde ripped off African artisans. So here's an installation view of MoMA's Primitivism. You see here the Young Women of Avignon, Picasso's Young Women of Avignon to the right. So this is from, these are pages within the catalog. So this is basically how they're taking this art and talking about it. And so you have these two pieces that are next to each other inside the MoMA's catalog. Picasso next to an African mass of uncertain origin from Picasso's personal collection. So it says here, mass Grebo, either the Ivory Coast or Liberia, painted wood and fiber from Picasso's collection. And then it's compared to this cubist construction of a guitar, right? So they're used in comparison with each other. So this is Africa, right? Large continent with lots of different countries and places and things happening inside of it. The difficulty with this exhibition is the sort of lack of specificity about what these objects mean, and the way that it's undertaken is to sort of put forth the modernist artist's viewpoint as being solely important, and all these other objects put to service of these artists' narrative, right? So it's problematic. So this is an exhibition review. And basically what happens is that the MoMA show draws comparisons to, if you guys remember, the Degenerate Art exhibition of Nazi Germany, which also drew comparisons between modernism and African and Jewish art in a negative way. And compounding this was the fact that MoMA, and this is something that came to light, had profited from the looting of Jewish art collections by the Nazis. The artwork that was, and there was artwork that was funneled through this process directly into their archives, right? So there are problematic things all over the place about this exhibition. So this is another catalog view, but of the Degenerate Art this time. And you can see that the comparisons with what they're doing is they're drawing these comparisons and saying, these are alike, right? Same thing that the MoMA's doing. So even though there's this idea that, I mean, the Nazis look down on these artworks and the MoMA is saying all this stuff is great, there's still a decontextualization that's happening. There's still like a lack of interest in sort of being accurate to African history, et cetera, et cetera. So this is from Carol Duncan, who does the Hot Mamas catalog. And the Hot Mamas is the exhibit that we're going to talk about next in relation to the artist Fred Wilson. It says, in theory, museums are public spaces dedicated to the spiritual enhancement of all who visit them. In practice, however, museums are prestigious and powerful engines of ideology. They are modern ritual spaces in which visitors enact complex and often deep psychic dramas about identity, dramas that the museum's stated, consciously intended programs do not and cannot acknowledge overtly. So this is MoMA's Hot Mamas, which Fred Wilson does installation for. And so this is his guarded view, which puts out the uniforms of the guards inside the museums and highlights the fact that usually these jobs are by African-American workers, right? And then on the other side, you have Picasso's Young Women of Avignon, to which Fred Wilson has attached an actual mask. And then he has put forward this stand to invite you to sort of look at that and acknowledge the connection between the two that's going on there. Okay, so this is another installation view from Hot Mamas. This is mine and yours from 1995. So on the left you have a photograph of an African-American family from the time period that these collectibles were being made. And there's a correlation being drawn between like what the reality of how African-American people looked and were during this time period versus the way that they were portrayed in American culture and in American artifacts, right? So this is Fred Wilson's sort of decade, like a decade has passed and now multiculturalism is risen. This is sort of his reaction to it. So then you have people like the Guerrilla Girls. And so this is sort of a new generation of institutional critique. The Guerrilla Girls would go in and intervene inside museums, do critiques like this, for instance. Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes, of all nudes, are female. Right? So this sort of tells you how the imbalance is, saying, do we have to, in order for a woman to get into the Met, she has to be an object to be looked at rather than being an artist. Okay, so then we come to the Whitney Biennial. And this I want to wait and talk about until we've the White Cube readings and the Beauty readings. Beauty actually is written before the 1993 Whitney Biennial. But you've also got the Roberta Smith article, which is the review of the 1993 Whitney Biennial. So I'm going to leave you guys here. But what I want you to be thinking about is, so I want you to be thinking about whether or not postmodernism is still going on, right? So what your assignment is for next class, I want you to find an example of work that's happening currently, like today, and using the sort of information that we've had about postmodernism, I want you to find some work and tell me whether or not you think that postmodernism has ended or not. So we think about the fact that text talking to other texts, so intertextuality, a pastiche of styles that don't refer back to an original. I want you to think about the idea of smaller narratives, some of these things like that we talk about that are markers or characteristics. think about those and come up with an example, like one piece, and answer that question.